professor at the Technical University of Lisbon, where you took your PhD way back in London Business School. So Rui has been doing research on entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation for quite some time, and I also know that you're a staunch believer in the Guardian, which was yesterday. And not so staunch a believer in the current Portuguese government.
I'm a left-wing nut.
Okay. So with that, we introduce the left-wing, so self-proclaimed left-wing nut. I know you have some interesting and thought-provoking facts to show from the paper. So please, great having you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Carl for inviting me. This is the issue of inequality and the issue of inclusive growth is particularly interesting to me. As Carl said, I took my PhD more than 15 years ago from London Business School. I'm an economist originally. I was for a while in the US. About 10 years ago, I returned to Portugal to the Technical University of Lisbon, which is now the University of Lisbon. And last September, I left and joined Brunel Business School, Brunel University. Brunel University is a young university in the west part of London. It's classified as one of the top 50 under 50-year-old universities in the world. And it's essentially an engineering tradition university. It's named after Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was the greatest Victorian engineer. He built the first underwater tunnel under the Thames in the 1820s. Which is still used today by the London Underground. He built the first battleship. He built a lot of the bridges that are still used by the Great Northern Line and a series of other railway lines around the UK. So it was a sort of an overwhelming presence during Victorian times, and is still seen today as the greatest engineer in British history. What I'm going to talk about is fairly different from what Erko did. I'm happy to talk about entrepreneurship and about how entrepreneurship may influence the change for inclusive growth, or the chance for inclusive growth as it is written in the program. It's the difference between the words is not really important because there seems to be no chance or no change. But essentially, my objective is to provide an overview of the situation in Portugal in terms of inequality, in terms of growth and inclusive growth, and how the crisis has impacted this. And then we can take discussion wherever direction you like. A little bit of context. Portugal went through, or emerged in 1974, 40 years ago, from almost 50 years of one-party rule, and in particular a very restrictive, closed economy where imports were fairly irrelevant, and where there were strict restrictions to entry in most industrial sectors. So the government built a system of local monopolies that never tried to enter international trade, and were happy to live off their captive market. What was built by the mid-70s was essentially an economy that was rather unequal, where wealth was concentrated in a few wealthy families, and where the country had no experience and no competitiveness to speak of in terms of international trade. Then there was a period of political and economic turmoil. The country lost its African colonies, and until 1982, the country went through a variety of changes, and only in the mid-80s it started to balance the economy in both institutional terms and productivity terms. In 1986, it entered the EU. It changed significantly its institution and its rules. The financial sector was the engine of growth, particularly through a series of productivity gains after privatization. And together with these productivity gains, there was some convergence with EU growth, and also, again, an increase in inequality. This was started to be addressed by socialist governments in the late 1990s, not directly concerned with inequality, but concerned with poverty. They designed a series of means-tested policies to help low-income families. In this process, inequality was reduced. I will show you a few figures in a moment. Essentially, what happened by the end of the first decade of the 2000s was that the public deficit had been bloated up to 9.4% of GDP. The country had to be bailed out by the EU and the IMF. Portuguese banks had to be bailed out by the government. This led to a big slowdown in entrepreneurial activity, and unemployment doubled. And in particular, the design of the measures of austerity that have been implemented have created a division within the middle class in Portugal, because they have addressed repeatedly civil servants by cutting their wages significantly, while the middle class working for the financial sector, real estate, insurance, has been largely unharmed. The VAT rate has been risen to 23.25% as of last month. Most of the taxes and the increases in government revenue have not been progressive, so they have focused mostly on the middle class and the lower classes. So there has been an increase in social instability, as far as we can talk about social instability in a relatively mild-mannered country as Portugal, where we don't have the habit of complaining too much. Still, the debt has kept increasing. It's now about 129% of GDP. The deficit has been reduced, but it's far from being balanced. The unemployment rate, as I said, has doubled from around 8% to 16%. The debt costs have been reduced, but growth remains unstable. We have seen that in the first quarter of this year, we again had negative growth, and even the deficit reduction has been below expectations. So just to give you an idea, the only period since the 1970s where we had convergence with the EU was in the second half of the 1980s, right after we joined the EU, and we received the first influx of cohesion funding from the EU. A lot of investment was done in infrastructure at this time, but most of these productivity gains occurred in the financial sector and in non-tradable goods, public utilities, banking and insurance, and the exporting sector remains mostly populated by small and medium-sized firms. After the 1992 crisis, convergence has virtually stopped. It has been floating around, and divergence started from the beginning of the crisis. The unemployment rate started increasing in the early 2000s and then shot up from the beginning of the crisis, and it's still going up. This only goes up to 2011 and about 14%. It is now at about 16%. Youth unemployment is above 35%. The drive towards reducing poverty is depicted by the amount of increase in public expenditure directed at social protection. You can see that during the 2000s, it was virtually the only component of government expenditure that went up significantly. All the other components were relatively stable. So, if anything, we may argue that what drove Portugal into a public sector deficit crisis was a drive to reduce poverty, increasing expenditure in poverty reduction and guaranteeing a minimum income to low-income families. All the other components of public expenditure were relatively under control. In fact, during the early 2000s, there was a drive to reduce public sector employment and public sector wages, which you can see here. And recently, after the crisis, the drive to reduce the wage bill in the public sector has not been accompanied by a reduction in public sector employment. The public sector employment has been reduced very little, but the wage bill has been reduced considerably through wage cuts. So there has not been a restructuring of the public sector as much as simply a cutting of expenditure through administrative wage cuts that in fact are still being legal, discussed whether they are constitutionally legal or not. The public debt, as I said, as a percentage of the GDP is still rising, although it is expected to be under control over the next 3 or 4 years. Feel free to interrupt me whenever you like. Basically, in terms of inequality, Portugal has always been one of the most unequal countries in Europe. That inequality was driven mostly from the period of one-party rule where industry was protected, international trade was restricted, and a reduced number of very wealthy families controlled the economy. But when Portugal started growing again after the turmoil of the mid-70s, the growth that occurred following entry into the EU was accompanied with another inequality drive. So government social policies which were not directed at inequality, they were directed at poverty, did reduce inequality from the late 1990s, but they were not effective enough to actually bring back the situation to what it was in the early 1980s. It was a reduction of inequality that has been that fell below the expectations. Still, as we will see, while Portugal was the most unequal country in the EU 15 until the beginning of the crisis, Spain and Greece have shot upwards of Portugal since 2008-9. The increase in inequality from the 1980s was not felt so much by the population because all income groups, all income sectors were increasing. So all boats, high tide floats all boats, lifts all boats. So there wasn't a feeling of inequality that was that created a lot of social upheaval. The means-tested social policies from the mid-1990s, the minimum guaranteed income, help explain why, in a context of high inequality, poverty was reduced. But if we look at strictly earnings inequality or wage inequality, we will see that the level of inequality was always higher than total inequality after you consider the government policy. So wage inequality stayed far higher than total inequality. The minimum wage in real terms and in relative terms to the low wage threshold has been coming down. Governments have steadfastly reduced to increase the minimum wage, which stands below 500 euro per month. And recently the government accepted to discuss the possibility of increasing the minimum wage if public sector unions accept some more flexibility in the labor market. So, if we look at the Gini coefficient, you see that monetary income, so earnings, have always been more unequal. And the drive to reduce poverty from the 1990s did reduce total income inequality more than actual monetary or wage inequality. The wealthiest earning shares increased from the mid-1980s to the beginning of the crisis. The 10% wealthiest increased from about 24% to 30%. The 1% wealthiest from about 4.6 to 6.6%. So by most measures of inequality, we have seen an increase in terms of wealth and in terms of earnings.
Excuse me.
Yep.
But it seems to increase until 1994, and then nothing happens.
Yes, essentially around 95 you see coming into power of a socialist government. I should point out that names mean little here. We have essentially a rotation between the Social Democratic Party, that is essentially a conservative party, and the Socialist Party, which is essentially a social democrat, liberal party. But from the mid-1990s, there was a drive to reduce inequality and to fight poverty. So you see a reduction in those terms. You can see it here as well from the mid-1990s. until the early 2000s. I will show further ahead that it's going upwards again. But yes, there was a decrease in the inequality.
It is not only, if compared to other countries, they have been continuously increasing inequality, most OECD countries over this time. So if you put that comparison, it's even more remarkable.
Yes, I mean, my explanation for this, and I'm open to discussion, is this one. It's that. It's essentially what drove Portugal into the debt crisis. It was the effort by left-wing, well, social democratic governments to increase social programs, increase minimum income, and create, if not a more equal, at least a society with less poverty. So I think the main idea that comes from that graph is that Portugal's plunging into debt and into the debt crisis was not really motivated by a bloated public sector or by considerable inefficiency. I mean, it's a very different situation from what you observe in Greece. Here was essentially perhaps a short-sighted or at least dangerous attempt to create a more equal society or a less poor society that drove the country into debt. Until the crisis, there was, as I said, there were no effective policies designed to fight inequality, but there were significant policies devised to fight poverty, and that kind of compensated and reduced inequality in the country until the beginning of the crisis. As the crisis deepened, most of these policies lost ground, stopped in their tracks, increased difficulty in access, lower benefits, the old political plot of the welfare queens, that there are a dozen people that drive a Mercedes to collect their minimum income, as if these people are representative of anything. So the substantial effort that had been conducted to reduce poverty stopped. Also, the effort that was put in practice since the 1970s that increased the number of university-educated students, or the number of college students, by about 20-fold, has also lost ground. The recurrent targeting of public servants, which tend to be more educated than the average private sector worker, is leading to some social instability. You have a sort of a division, as I said, between educated public sector workers and private sector workers. So it is hard to say where this is going in terms of social balance. Still, the drive to reduce poverty has had an impact, and it's still being felt, although inequality, according to the more recent Eurostat statistics, has been shooting up again. Portugal is actually now below Greece in terms of inequality for the first time since the 1990s. And it is also below Spain for the first time since the 1990s, and very close to Italy. So there is still an impact from the social policies of the 2000s being felt. Still, when we compare Portugal with Finland, Denmark, Sweden, we are talking about completely different reality in terms of inequality. But not so different from Germany, Italy, or the UK.
Could you just tell what kind of measure do you use for inequality?
This is the Gini coefficient for income.
No.
Not the numbers.
The
Oh.
Gini coefficient is
You're
not
right.
6. This is probably some ratio.
It's the Eurostat measure, I'm not sure. I can find out. Unlike this, which comes from Statistics Portugal and the labor market surveys and the household budget surveys, this one comes from the Eurostat, so I'm not entirely sure what's the origin, although I suspect it's the labor force survey. I can find that out.
So I have a question, a follow-up on something you mentioned earlier. You said that the institutional difference between Portugal compared to Greece, Italy, and Spain is not that Portugal had a bloated public sector in reform.
Compared to Greece, not
Yes.
Italy and Spain.
So, and the outcome has been a rather reduced in cost and spending, and especially wages on public sector workers. But there hasn't been institutional reforms.
And even in the public sector, you see that since the crisis started, the red line is the wage bill, and the blue line is the number of workers. So you don't see as much of a restructuring of the public sector as you see simply a sharp reduction in wages. So,
Yes, Roger Westman, I'm an economist from Finland. But isn't that, I mean, if you argue that the public sector isn't terribly inefficient, the problem for Portugal is simply that incomes and outlays don't match. You need to have an internal evaluation. Isn't that the correct policy then, to cut wages instead of firing people, because then they can still continue to produce public services, but you get incomes and revenues balanced?
I agree in principle that the internal devaluation is the policy that, or is the inevitable outcome. I fear that the way it has been conducted, targeting mostly public sector workers, might not be the most balanced one. But yes, I mean, reduction in or devaluation is inevitable as if Portugal stays in the euro. So what is happening is necessary. I would argue that perhaps a more balanced approach to the problem would be to target also the large firms, which are mostly non-tradable good firms, public utilities, banks, and also to find ways to restructure some public services which are either unnecessary or inefficient. But as I said, my main argument is that a lot of the increase in government debt was due to social programs. Simply, productivity did not increase in Portugal enough to sustain this drive to reduce poverty, and that created the crisis.
The policies that you have looked at so far, to me, there's a lot of supply push in the sense of focus on public sector expenditure and expenditure on different kinds of programs, all the rest. Has there been, how much consideration has there been given to facilitating conditions in which the economic activity can pick up? I'm again thinking about entrepreneurship, and that's the other side of the equation. I know that in Greece they haven't been particularly successful in that, and you still have tremendous barriers to starting new businesses and red tape and what have you. How is it in Portugal?
I think the problem in Portugal is different, but I'm not entirely sure how it can be addressed. Maybe a better diagnostic of the situation can be done. Institutional barriers to entrepreneurship in Portugal are very few. Barriers to firm growth do probably exist. As I said, the exporting sector in Portugal is mostly made up of small and medium enterprises, but there are not enough of them exporting. The problem with Portugal is not the problem of self-employment or of small businesses. There's a lot of self-employment, there's a lot of small businesses, but these businesses do not grow, and only a small percentage of them actually export. So the issue is driving policies that may drive the creation of more exporting small businesses. I think inevitably this is the sector that may bring Portugal out of this productivity funk that it has been since the 1990s. The question is how you do that. Previous governments before the crisis had an approach based mostly on education and investment in science and technology. What they probably didn't realize is that this is a long-term effort, and it wouldn't produce effects in 3 or 4 years. And now that has stopped. So I don't see at the moment any kind of short-run or long-run policy that may help, as you say, the supply side and the supply of entrepreneurs grow. Actually, even though we know that rising unemployment may lead to increased self-employment and entrepreneurship, this has not happened in Portugal. Entrepreneurship has been driven down by the crisis, which is probably also a result of the credit crunch.
I have I actually took up the graph comparing Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain in the SEDA data, and it seems huge gaps in opportunity perception of these things. And then the risk, attitudes of fear of failure seems to be a big issue there, or the risk acceptance, reverse of risk acceptance would be something there. But yeah, those seem to be the two big ones.
Yeah.
Internationalization, by the way, shows up in this graph too, what you said about SMEs being export-oriented.
It's, I mean, by and far the largest chunk of exporters in Portugal are SMEs. If you take out 2 or 3 very large exporters, which are mostly foreign companies, Volkswagen has a huge assembly line in Portugal that at its peak made up for like 13% of Portuguese exports. So if you take out those cases, it's mostly SMEs. But I agree that one of the problems is the perception of risk, and the fact that those people that would be more likely to create growing businesses and exporting businesses are usually employed by large companies. They have comfortable wages, and they just feel the risk of exploiting an opportunity by themselves is too high. This is partly cultural. If you go back in time to Hofstede's whole cultural values, uncertainty avoidance in Portugal is rampant. But it's also a perception of the fact that you have no social net if you fail as an entrepreneur. But if you fail as an employee, or if you get unemployed, you still have some social net. So, and I have argued this many times in Portugal, that a solution to this has to be found if we want to address the issue of risk perception. But that implies, again, increased public expenditure, which is something that you really can't talk about at the moment. Any more questions? Okay, going just to close the social and political impacts of this. At the moment, by most measures from either the Eurostat or private surveys, suggest that inequality has played a big role in reducing trust in public institutions, in declining what was always a very positive evaluation of the advantages of EU membership. EU membership has always been seen in Portugal as extremely positive. There is no anti-European or independent movement in Portugal. In fact, parties with either racist tendencies or anti-immigration tendencies in Portugal are simply not representative. That doesn't mean there isn't a general popular feeling about that. It just means that it has not been translated into the political arena. Still, the poorest parts of the population have been suffering significantly. The crisis has spread into large sectors of the middle class. It has created this divisive gap between educated public sector workers and financial sector and private sector workers. A lot of young, highly educated people is emigrating in droves, a lot of them towards Europe's bigger destination for immigration, which is London and the southeast of the UK. The present government has ironically actually encouraged this, encouraged educated people to emigrate. Public sector workers, of course, feel that they have to pay more taxes because of the bloated public sector. So this has created social tension as much as there is social tension in Portugal, which is something that you talk about in the small intervals between soccer games. I think the biggest problem here, as Erika pointed out, is about the supply of entrepreneurs and the possibility to bring about industrial restructuring through entrepreneurial exporting firms. I think there is not enough being done in Portugal at the moment to look into this as a way to provide a sustainable way out of the crisis. And policy needs to address this because there are issues such as uncertainty avoidance or risk reduction that really cannot be addressed by government policy. The government has, in spite of the reduction in public expenditure, is still making an effort to finance small firms, to put money into venture capital and syndication funds, but there's not a lot of demand for this. So it's more a problem of the supply of entrepreneurs than actually of institutional support to those who show up. Thank you for that.
With that, we're actually quite nicely just at the end. So, Rui, thanks so much. This was really fascinating. And now we switch over to the Swedish situation, and I think Martin is going to show some similar graphs, and perhaps a bit more into the area of entrepreneurship. So looking at inequality measures both for workers and for entrepreneurs in Sweden. Let's see what we have here. Yes. And Martin, you're really an economic historian, right? Yes. But I would say that much of your work is in economic geography. So you publish in these areas and is now working with me and with Daniel here and Matthias. And I haven't seen these slides before. So it will be interesting as well.
But you're part of it, you're responsible.
Yes, thanks so much.
So thanks. Yes, my name is Martin Korpi, and this is, as you see, this is work I've been doing together with Daniel Halvarsson, sitting over there, Matthias Stålnack and Carl Wallberg here. This is very much, I'm going to present these ideas here. This is very much work in progress, so to speak. But thanks to Matthias, who's been doing the benign research assistance here, we now have some descriptives that we'd like to present also. But like we said, we take this opportunity to sort of pick your brain here and pick all your brains here and to get feedback here on what we like to do and the ideas and how we can go about this. Yes. So any comments and thoughts are very welcome. But the outline of this talk, I thought I'll first start with a little bit of background, why we think this is worthwhile, and it might be worthwhile doing. I will present research problem and theory, and a little bit of research design and research questions. And then we get into the two ideas of the papers that we have, and the analytical framework, so to speak. And then the descriptives that we have. And then I have to take questions and comments. So, a little bit of the background here. As we think about this, we have two important trends here, of course. We have rising income dispersion in many OECD countries, and since the 1970s and maybe 80s in Sweden. And this has, of course, been starting to, the discussion here is that it's getting a little bit problematic. At least in the public discussion, it's seen as a bit problematic. Not by all, but it's that way the discussion is going. And yet, at the same time, we have a highlighted focus on entrepreneurship, which is as a key to continued growth. And that is, of course, why we're here today. Which is usually hailed as something very positive for society at large. So we're kind of interested in this dichotomy here. And in previous work, factors, when you look at rising income inequality, kind of in the mainstream research in economic literature, you see factors such as technological change and deunionization and international migration are kind of these smoking guns that we talk about as causes for rising inequality. But there has been little attention devoted to a possible role of entrepreneurship and how it might affect income distribution and income dispersion. And we're not saying that we think that this may explain the big part of the rising inequality since 30, 40 years back, but we think that since this is it's a public topic that is talked about a lot, and we think that we should sort of know, maybe we can know a little bit more about these mechanisms, the links between these. So, theory and research problem. The way we think about this, at least at the current state, is on the one hand, some entrepreneurs are seen as so highly productive that ordinary employers cannot afford to have them as employees. And this would imply that if we see increasing levels of entrepreneurship, this might augment inequality or increase inequality by increasing the share of top income earners in a society. It may then increase growth, of course, but it may also increase income inequality. And on the other hand, if these entrepreneurs are mainly necessity entrepreneurs, so that are sort of more, that start companies because maybe they cannot find other employment. Rising inequality we may find rising inequality because of increasing the share of low-income earners in a society, and that would imply increasing inequality, but maybe not such big effects on growth. And also, if we talk about entrepreneurship in the public sector, that was previously the public sector, we may also see increasing income dispersion because previously we had monopoly in the public sector. We only have one buyer of labor power, and when we move into privatizing these, previously public sectors, you may have competition for top labor, for good labor, you may have competition for good doctors, etc. And you might get increasing dispersion just looking at the labor force, or people working within a certain sector. So these are kind of the theoretical background. So when we look at research design, how are we planning to go about this, or how are we going about this, is that Sweden has recently, of course, deregulated several industries, such as healthcare, education, elderly, and childcare, by opening up these for private entrepreneurs. And we argue that this constitutes a type of quasi-natural experiment, as we call it in economic literature, that we can sort of allow, that we can look at developments before and after a reform and see sort of the effect of this reform. And it allows us to assess the influence of new firm entry here on job creation and income mobility, both among employees and among firm founders within these industries. And at the same time, we see large variation in terms of entrepreneurship across regions. It's been there's large differences across regions in how fast these reforms have been implemented. The reforms have, of course, been passed at the same time, but we've seen very different rates of entrepreneurship across regions in Sweden. Some have hardly any type of entrepreneurship within these sectors, and some regions have a lot of activity going on. Seek to we want to exploit this to sort of be able to address causality. Okay, so looking at our research questions, these are three mainly. We have, does entrepreneurship imply increasing within industry wage dispersion, wage inequality within an industry? And if so, is this due to the top income levels rising at a at a comparatively faster rate, or is it because of the bottom income deciles, or bottom income within these industries losing out? From where do we see this spread of income happening, if we see this? And lastly, which this is kind of the first two papers, or the first paper that we want to address the first of these two questions. And then lastly, to what extent does this also imply changes in inequality at a macro level? We want to see if we can see any effects on a macro level. And by macro, we're here talking about regional level. We think it's too complicated to look at a national level at this stage, but if we look at a regional level, we can control for a lot of factors. We know more what's going on if we look at the regional level. So, the idea is, the paper number 1, we want to address research questions 1 and 2 at the regional industry level. We want to address what's happening with inequality within these industries, within a certain region. We're also thinking of looking at perhaps also a regional occupational level that we can sort of address this question looking at, for instance, just doctors or just teachers, and to be able to get another angle at this problem, what's going on. And what we want to first start doing is estimate a series of regional industry level inequality measures, such as Gini, the mean logarithmic deviation, MLD, tiles index, and GE2. And these are sort of, we have a spread here in these measures, because Gini usually kind of focuses on differences kind of in the middle of the income distribution. And MLD and tiles index and GE2, they're more sensitive to what's happening in the top of the income distribution. Or as we move up towards the top, these kind of cover these. These are more sensitive to what's going on in the top of the income distribution. And then second stage, we want to use these measures as dependent variables when we estimate industry level panel regressions. That is, we want to test the impact of entrepreneurship controlling for other factors, such as what's happening with educational dispersion within this sector, labor market size and levels of unionization, etc. And we should also say that when we estimate panel regressions, we also know when we have data over time, we can of course try to address these questions or other influence here on entrepreneurship, such as attitudes and these things that differ over regions, such as Erko was talking about this week. How different clusters in Sweden might affect entrepreneurship. So we have this, we can control the way for this unobservables that are hard to measure with measurements. So, our analytical framework here so far, this is how we think about it. Once we have this information on income inequality for these industries at regional level, we want to model the variation over time in a second step. And this is just a formal way of saying what I said in the other slide in a second. Where we have inequality in industry J, in region R, in time T, and then we estimate this panel model where we have an intercept and a time dummy, and we're interested in estimating the effect here on X is a bunch of control variables, and we want to estimate beta here, which is the effect of entrepreneurship.
Martin, just remind me, how is entrepreneurship measured here?
We haven't, at this, we just have the number of self-employees or employer entrepreneurs within this that are working within their own company or started a company.
So it's self-employed?
Yes, or people working within their own aktiebolag. Incorporation. We don't have any other, but we're thinking what measurement we should use here. Do you have any suggestions here?
I have absolutely no suggestion. My suggestion would be that if you use self-employment, you should write self-employment. But I know that's radical.
Yes.
Well, one suggestion would seem to be to, if you have a case for reading the deregulated industries, you would simply use private actors,
Private actors?
private firms.
Right. But what would that be?
Well, I mean, if you have an industry where you didn't allow private actors before, let's say, time period T,
Yeah,
and then you serve in time period T+2, there's a private actor selling those services.
sure.
That's an entrepreneur.
Yeah. That's,
So, but the argument would be that because you introduce private firms, then you have higher wage variance across different actors.
Yes. And you
And
actually
then
test
you
that.
don't need to have the entrepreneur at all because it's going to be the entrepreneur as the agent, it's going to be your firm. And it's going to increase both the name and the wage variance within the firm, and that should be reflected on the industry as a whole.
Yeah.
Are you using the Swedish national employer employee data?
yes.
What you could possibly do is use the business owners who are also the top managers of the company.
That would give us more
That
exact.
means that they are the entrepreneur who created the company and is running the company.
Mm.
This is usually what we do with the Portuguese national employer employee.
Okay. So, yeah, all right.
I think that what are you interested in? Are you interested in the individual level, or are you interested in the fact that you have entrepreneurial agents coming in and steering up the soup? There's two different questions. I mean, you're compounding them here.
Okay.
May I comment on that quickly?
I think we're,
Because what I meant was that one way in doing it, but it might be because you can look at latest version,
Yes.
or within the private actors in the previous regulated industry. They compare the latest version of similar tasks in that industry, of those private actors with those public
Yes.
organizations.
That's what we're trying to do. We will try to do.
Okay.
yeah, I think we're maybe on the same thing here. My name is Andreas Bergström. I'm from England Forest. I'm also on the board of ELF, which is formally, I guess, organizing this, although it's being doing the job. Don't you actually need to look at two different things? Because, I mean, one idea you have here is that income inequality could increase because you have self-employed entrepreneurs making a lot of money, or you have some self-employed people making very little money.
Yes.
But then you have this other idea that there's private companies coming into the formal public sector.
Yes.
And, I mean, those might be big companies. I mean, you're not looking at self-employed people anymore there. I mean, because you would expect to see the effect even in quite big companies, because what we know at least from anecdotes, so private companies coming into the formal public sector have larger wage dispersions.
Yes.
So maybe you actually, I mean, actually two different things you are looking at, so maybe you would actually need to have two different analytical frameworks.
Could be. I mean, we haven't yet. Right now we're just divided. We're looking at inequality among entrepreneurs within these sectors, and we're looking at wage dispersion, income inequality just among the employees. We don't know the number of people working within private firms within this, which would be good information. I mean, it would be. It's information that we'll try to get a hold of. But, then we hope to be able to pinpoint sort of from what are the sources here of these changes in inequality. Is it among the employees, or is it because entrepreneurs are coming into the public sector? I think it's, yeah, I have to think about that.
Yeah, continue.
All right.
Could I ask you about the labor market size?
Yes.
Because obviously most of these businesses that you've been looking into are providing services for a very local community, which means that there has to be a consumer market, so to speak,
services.
rather than a labor market.
Yeah.
And so, for example, if you take communities surrounding Stockholm, for example, maybe there isn't really a labor market in that community because they're all going into Stockholm.
No,
But you've got a lot of consumers.
Yeah. But when we're talking about a regional level, we're thinking of labor markets, and they are largely the, if you look at Stockholm labor market, I mean, Uppsala is in Stockholm labor market, you have a very large region where there is also, it's not just only a labor market, it's mostly, it's also the consumer market for services to a large extent. And the reason why we want to control for it is that we know inequality rises with labor market size. So if you have a larger labor market, you usually have higher wage dispersion. So it's a factor that you have.
And you're looking at the labor market in general, not just for that industry that you're studying.
Now we're estimating the our measures of within industry inequality or wage dispersion. We do that at the local level or the local labor market level.
For that particular industry.
Yes, within that labor market, within that region.
So if you study private school, the effect of private schools, it would be the labor market for teachers.
Yes, well, the teachers working within that certain labor market. That would be that. And if we get increasing entrepreneurship within that labor market and within that industry within that labor market, we want to try to gauge that effect. Okay. I'll continue. So, in our second paper here, building upon that sector-specific contribution of entrepreneurship to levels of inequality within industries, we seek to model total regional level inequality development. And the thought is, what we're thinking here, at least initially here, is that we calculate from the first paper, we know the industry, we know entrepreneurship and the effect it has on industry-specific, on a contribution to inequality within that industry locally. So what we want to do here is we can look at the development of inequality in the region as a whole, and we know the contribution of each of the different sectors or each of the different industries that are working there. And if we know the contribution of entrepreneurship within these sectors, we can sort of calculate a counterfactual, as we're thinking. That we can calculate what the level of inequality would have been sort of without this contribution from entrepreneurship within these industries. That is not a precise measurement, but it would give an idea if entrepreneurship and possible effect that it has in certain industries, if that can translate to a sort of macro level or a regional level. Is kind of the thought that we have in this second paper. So it would be sort of a counterfactual approach to gauge the effect of entrepreneurship on a macro or regional level.
What is the fundamental goal of your papers here? Because in labor economics, you seldom see self-employed people being excluded, both in the economics and sociology, for the simple reason that they are on their own, that they're not responsible, they are responsible for their livelihood and how to drive their income and also how much time to allocate that, which is very different from the employee position where you're employed and you have strict kind of things to do. So what is this? So the notion of it drives income inequality in what way? Of those that are remain employed suffer for that, or is just because you add a group with a higher variance to the pool in the labor market? So what is it? Because this has an implication both the theory and policy of how you think about income inequality and what are the pros and cons of income inequality. inequality. So what is the thinking behind these papers when you kind of add this group that is not normally in there?
See if I can. I mean, we want to sort of separate an effect that, yes, we can look at an effect by adding those entrepreneurs that were previously not working within this sector, or that were employees within this sector. And we can sort of separate what effect it would have on the income dispersion as the total income dispersion within that industry.
Yeah, but so basically, if you have this,
Yes.
and then you add the entrepreneurs, then you're saying that you're going to have an effect here, and then you're going to have an effect here.
Or we don't know. We'll try to.
Well, that's what you expect to find
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
at the top and the bottom.
Mm.
Now, what is interesting to me is that, well, if I'm just adding, it's like I put some Nutella here and another bit of Nutella, but the bread is still the same.
Mm.
But what I was, so is that the question you want to target, or is it the question that you have this, which is basically people that are employed, that if you add some Nutella in there, that will also rise or sink, not
Yeah.
having those. So is that the question mark? Is this what you want to look? Is how the bread is going to increase or decrease?
To me, we want to estimate both these effects. We want to see what happens to entrepreneurs when if they're ending up in the bottom of the income distribution or the top of the income distribution. And we want to look at those that are working within these industries, that are not entrepreneurs. So, and we may get effects both happening within that group and within these new entrepreneurs on the total.
Maybe we should go look on the previous data.
Oh yeah, I still have some time to go.
Yes, go.
Yeah. So, we're moving now to descriptives. This is a lot of information crammed into one figure here. So what we're starting at, we've been looking at the total welfare sector, and we here compare the employees working within that sector and the entrepreneurs that are working within that sector for two time periods. We have 2005, which we started out to in cross sections, and then for 2009, which is the last year that we have data in this current data set. We hope to extend this with data up to 2000, up to now. So what we have here is, if you look at the whole welfare sector, you see highest inequality among the entrepreneurs as compared to employees, which may be kind of what we would expect, but it's what we see here at least. And there's not much happening over time over these 4 years here. We see a slight increase among the entrepreneurs, but not, I mean, it could also be white noise, so to speak. And we also see increasing entrepreneurship, and here, in absolute terms, there are entrepreneurs 4,343 and then 5,000 in 2009. So we have something happening here, of course. Also, if we calculate, if we estimate a ratio, just the number of employees to number of employers, number of entrepreneurs as a ratio to the number of employees, we also find that this increases somewhat, 0.45% to 52%, 0.52. It's not a lot, but it's at least a little bit.
Martin, are these both self-employed and self-employed
Yes, they are.
corporation?
Right. So we haven't separated these two.
Because they have higher median income than the employees, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. But like I said, inequality is higher, dispersion is higher.
But you don't find that in the overall economy. In the overall economy, you find lower income for the entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So here you're looking at the sector where actually the entrepreneurs are more well off than the workers
Mm-hmm.
on the average, right?
I think so. It varies a bit by sector.
And these sectors are all the welfare sectors.
Yes. Like I said, childcare, healthcare, education. But I'll break these down in a moment, so like I said, it's not a lot happening over time. Then we break this down into we look at the same thing when we look at sectors, and we start by looking at just the employees, and we compare them over 2 periods. And here we have education, healthcare, geriatric care as a sort of. And here, just the we see highest inequality among the within healthcare, but again, not much happening over time if we look at just employees. Yeah, it's even decreasing a little bit, so it's not a lot going on here. And then when we look at a similar figure, looking at entrepreneurs within these different subsectors, we see highest inequality among within the healthcare. If we compare education, child and geriatric care. So if we look at the healthcare sector, that's where inequality is highest.
Sorry to be a pain in the ass.
Go ahead.
How do you deal with it? A lot of those that are employees are part-time workers, most women and stuff like that, who should drive down the region in some of these sectors. How are you dealing with whether they're working full-time or not? We assume that most entrepreneurs would work full-time. So
We don't have data on
Because we don't have
full-time,
that.
so we haven't dealt with that at this stage.
Okay.
But we could only look at, I mean, a way to deal with that is to just look at men working within the sector, because they tend to work more full-time than women, but we haven't addressed that. Yes. And so inequality is also higher here than compared to employees, as a general comment. And then we break this down into regions. I'm trying to, and here we have an example of healthcare. We see most entrepreneurial activity in the big cities, the 3 big cities. 1.65%, which may not be a lot, but in 2005, a little bit littler in the smaller numbers in the principal cities, which fall in as the principal city, and much lower in the sparsely populated regions. And over time, we see the largest increase also in percentage terms when we look at big cities. Slight increase in principal cities. It's even going down here in the numbers that we have for the sparsely populated regions, decreasing somewhat. And when we look at the employees over regions, kind of breaking this down a little bit further, yes, inequality is still highest in the big cities, but we don't see a lot of differences, and not much happening over time here either. It's still pretty stable. And then we break this down, inequality by region among entrepreneurs. And here we don't see it, the largest difference is actually coming from the sparsely populated region, which is here called backcountry. Sorry, it's a bit of a derogatory term, so if anybody's here from the sparsely populated regions, we apologize. But we have a low number, we don't have many observations here, like here. So we have it's only based on 23 observations there in 2005, 16, so it's actually going down. But the largest dispersion is among these sparsely populated regions. And this is just a kind of an outline. We started looking at kind of an extremes here. We may have to choose different regional levels to look at. So, conclusion so far. Okay, summary. Income dispersion generally higher among entrepreneurs as opposed to employees, which would be something we might expect. Income inequality varies by region. It's highest in bigger cities, both among employees and entrepreneurs. I have to change that a little bit. It's actually, when you look at entrepreneurs, it's actually higher in the lowest, in the lowest, or the sparsely populated regions. So I have to change that a little bit. Within the welfare sector, healthcare at highest level of inequality, both among employees and entrepreneurs. And we see sort of small changes over time, as of yet. We see some change within the healthcare sector, broadly speaking, but within the other sort of subsectors of the welfare sector, not a lot is happening. But larger changes among entrepreneurs as compared to employees, of course, within this healthcare sector. So, this is where we are today, so to speak. So, any comments? Thanks.
Isn't there one more possibly interesting result, which is that although it's only 4 years, the income distribution is constant or even slightly more towards being more egalitarian within the employed sample. And then there's the compositional effect, right? So to the extent that total inequality has increased, it's actually, well, the small increase must be entirely driven by entrepreneurs, mainly the composition and also the slight increase within entrepreneurs.
Yeah, there must be, at least if we look at the healthcare sector where we see something happening.
Also from the other. Yeah, but the composition effect, they move from 45% to 52%.
Yeah.
So even if it doesn't increase within the various entrepreneurial sectors, the fact that they become more numerous will work to increase average inequality in the population.
Yes. We could, I mean, we can work with it, if we look at Tiles Index, if we use these other measures, you can decompose changes to a better extent than you can do with using the Gini.
Exactly, because the Lorentz curves were crossing.
Yeah, so we can, we hope to be able to do that in the next stage. And see if we can, to decompose the changes and see if it's done, if it's a composition effect with entrepreneurs coming in, that we can see this change due to that. But that's a good point.
To tie that back, wouldn't at least then the tentative patterns shown here imply that the increase in inequality in these sectors are driven by highly productive entrepreneurs because their median earnings are much higher. It's not driven by the lowest and driven by the higher.
Yes.
We'll go back to this question.
I mean, because the median is higher compared to 2005 and 2009.
Median is so much higher among the entrepreneurs than the employees. And, as Andrea said, the increased shifts seem to be only driven by the small fraction of entrepreneurs in the whole sector. That those two facts put together would imply that the total net effect is not driven by the poor entrepreneurs, but only by rich entrepreneurs. No?
Maybe. Because you see, the entrepreneurs, the gains among the entrepreneurs, that was mainly, at least from what I see here, it's mainly driven with the healthcare sector. Within the other two sectors that we looked at, the median income is pretty low among the entrepreneurs. So it could be, it may be that you're right, but we'll have to look at it again. Sort of. But it's okay. So on this.
I think Carl is right on that, but a completely different issue is that I have still problems with the words we are using. What you just referred to as highly productive entrepreneurs, well, I would argue we don't know that they are entrepreneurs, they are businessmen, and we don't know that they are highly productive, we know that they earn a lot, right? So, my comment still applies. What you're saying is that people start business in these sectors and they earn a lot. Productivity, we need to take into account what they are producing and the quality, there are big question marks there. And so,
it's hard to estimate productivity.
Well, especially in healthcare and education.
Even more.
But I'm sure it will translate to income in those